Welcome. This is sort of like an Olympic event, really. We've just hit the final stages. You've done really well. We had the marathon yesterday and the last run home, and this is our 4x100 event, highlight of the Olympics, as everyone knows. What we're focused on here is really looking at policy. So we've heard a lot over the past 2 days around all the innovative research that's been going on. We have a concern around the broadening gap between what is happening in research practice and then what happens in mainstream practice, and it's just getting larger and larger and larger. So what is the role of policy and strategy in being able to build this up both at the government level, federal, state, alongside at the institutional level, and then down into the individual researchers? How do they actually roll their work out to be adopted around the university? So I have my 4 esteemed colleagues, experts in all areas of life: Grace Lynch, Harrison Keller, Chris Brooks, and Doug. Needs no further introduction. Doug. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Grace, who will talk about it at the government level.
Great. Thank you very much. Just as George was saying before about the Society for Learning Analytics Research, it is a not-for-profit organization of leading international researchers exploring the impact of big data and analytics on the education sector. And there were a number of Australian universities have been involved, and from the federal government in Australia, the Office for Learning and Teaching approached SOLAR and asked them to develop a discussion paper for policymakers and for senior executives of universities on improving the quality and productivity of the higher education sector, specifically looking at a systems level deployment of learning analytics. So many of the learning analytics initiatives have been done on the small unit subject course level, depending on the language that you use for your institution. And one of the things that we wanted to do is to look at and investigate areas that had done a wider system implementation or an institutional system implementation. And one of the things that we did was we looked at an evaluation of benefits in sectors where analytics deployment is more advanced than education, very much in the health sector. The health sector has done a lot with looking at big data and looking at system implementation, and how could we learn from that into the education sector with what we're doing. We also looked at analysis of provincial, territory, state, and national data collection policies in the education sector. So, and a couple of the keynotes and the presenters have mentioned today, one of the lagging features of learning analytics has been around policy implementation, which leads into the ethics and ethics application and how we move forward. So we wanted to look at those areas who had done something around a policy, establishing a policy and looking what it was doing and where it was coming from. And we wanted to specifically look at universities, different universities around the world who were developing a specific analytic strategy of what they were doing and how they were moving. And then we also wanted to look at the role of corporate partners. Very much from the conversation yesterday, I very much see that it's a partnership. We are working together with organizations in being able to look at not only the research, but in developing the tools and developing what's happening and looking at those sorts of things that are coming in. Now, this data, and this slide, this is Eric Duvall's slide that he's presented many times from Leuven, and it is discovering the value in data. It's not an issue of the amount of data, it's making meaningful use of that data. And one of the big things that a lot of people talk around learning analytics is around sense making. What are the key questions? What is it that you want to know, and why is it important to know that? And what are you going to do when you find it out? One of the difficulties is if you're not prepared to take action, don't ask the question. Don't waste your time, money, effort, and everything you're doing. And one of the things that we found with the systems implementation that were very successful is they had a clear idea of what it was they wanted to know and why it was critical to do that and what steps were they going to put into place to do that. So it really is looking around at that value of looking at what's happening and what's coming in with that. Now, we did a number of case studies, and the case studies are in the report, and they're on the SOLAR website. It looks very nice when it's printed. It's printed by the federal government, and it's all available as a PDF, and it's all free and downloaded from the website. So the lessons from the case studies, as I mentioned earlier, was asking the right question. Asking the right questions at the beginning of what's happening. And one of the key things, and this is Shane's phrase that he uses a lot, it's getting the actionable data into the hands of those who need to know. So it's moving from data accessible to data actionable. Actually being able to move to see what you can do and how you can move forward. And that was one of the key messages that we fed back to the federal government. It is around being able to take action with what we could do and looking at the successes from those case studies. It is, we have identified, and we had a panel yesterday, it is a skill and capability shortage, and yet it shouldn't be. We had 30 wonderful new PhD researchers in this area, and yet we can't seem to get them jobs in the right place to make the difference. It's clearly identified that the skills capability shortage in making pedagogical questions around learning analytics and the data is key. And we need to think about how we can shorten that gap of what we can do. And part of that is working more collaboratively together, not working in individual institutional silos, but working collaboratively in systems, coming together, working in partnerships, working collaboratively with our corporate sponsors in being able to move forward. And that's one way that we can minimize that gap. One of the other things as well, and it's like any change process, we know leadership is critical. You don't think we should have to say that, but yes, we do. It is about having the leadership informed to understand what does this data mean? How is it shaped and what's happening? Now, being a mathematician, when people say numbers don't lie, I can make numbers say anything you want. We can make them dance, we can turn them around, we can interpret them. We have to be very careful around that interpretation. And we have to be very careful around making informed decisions from the right data. And there's been lots of comments where people have talked about that data and what's coming. And one of the things where we see that there is an opportunity, and George may talk about it later, is one of the things we're looking at is possibly developing a leadership summit, of looking at high-end senior managers within the university for them to understand the sorts of issues we're grappling with and what it does and what it means for them. And that's one of the recommendations we have made to the federal government as well. And it also, it's getting access to data. I don't know, maybe your universities are different from the ones that I've worked in, but we do tend to work in a siloed industry, education, institution, and it's getting all of those data bridges to talk to each other. And if you haven't had a chance to look at, Phil Long's done some really nice things of looking at what you have to do from a system level. Now this is actually a learning analytics sophistication model that we developed as part of the thing, and it's moving from what I had said earlier, those small pockets of innovation, into excellence, and excellence into transformative practice. So it's moving along the maturity level, it's looking at systems deployment, it's looking at coming up with what's happening of learning analytics and those sorts of things from an institution. And just the last thing very quickly, and it all is in the reports, the recommendation was that yes, analytics can drive productivity if we have the right data and ask the right questions, we know what to do. And we actually need we recommend a national task force, pulling all of those stakeholders together, corporate, institutions, those coming together. Looking at current national data analytics frameworks, where we already have them for some in the health area, why can't we apply the same principles in education? Looking at very much the privacy and ethic guidelines that are coming in, and we've got another panel talking about that. And one of the other things is looking at being a little more about, rather than just talking about privacy, which we have done a lot, getting some specific guidelines that people can use and can help. And further, I mentioned the leadership program and partnering with educational data mining and other learning analytics research communities. So that's just a very quick, short synopsis of the report. It's riveting, it's just wonderful. You just read it and you'll just keep yourself up at night. It's wonderful to read. Thank you.
Good morning. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you all this morning. I'm Harrison Keller. I'm the Vice Provost for Higher Education Policy and Research at UT Austin, and I'm also Executive Director of our Center for Teaching and Learning. And I'd like to reflect with you on 3 points this morning. First, I'd like to provide some background, tell you a little bit about our work at UT Austin. I'll talk briefly about some of the larger policy contexts in which we operate, and then I'll discuss some of the challenges that lie ahead as we work on strategy and policy for learning analytics. So first, a little bit of background about UT Austin. So UT Austin is the largest and oldest university in the University of Texas system. We have about 52,000 residential students who come from all 50 states in the United States and about 100 other countries. We have about 3,000 faculty, about 14,000 staff, and our operating budget's about $2.5 billion, including about $600 million in research. So we've been working pretty intensely over the last couple of years to develop and launch an ambitious new infrastructure to support teaching and learning, both on and off campus. So a major focus of our work has been to reposition our Center of Teaching and Learning so that it could work in closer partnership with our leading faculty. We've begun driving substantial resources through the Center for Teaching and Learning to engage and inspire, hopefully, and support our faculty thought leaders and our key departments. So this year we're going to drive about $2 million through the Center for Teaching and Learning to various initiatives with faculty who are working in 5 thrust areas. And our 5 thrust areas are social learning, experiential learning, online learning, blended learning, and of course, learning analytics. We're also funding what we call course coordinators, which are lecturers and postdocs in about half a dozen key high throughput departments. And these are assigned to help improve and curate and work with faculty on the use of digital content that we've developed at the university. So as part of this group, we're also establishing a large integrated learning sciences division that will have between 30 and 40 professional staff for faculty support, development and curation of digital content, and maintenance of an integrated learning analytics technology stack for research and evaluation and for visualization and analytics. And we've pulled together various external-facing groups, including our University Extension, our Professional Development Center, and an online high school and some other programs into a new business development group that's connected to the Center for Teaching and Learning. So our vision at UT Austin is that we want to integrate these different components of our work to partner with faculty to develop high-quality content and learning experiences that we can deploy on multiple platforms and multiple modes of delivery. And that can be an academic decision or part of our service mission or business decision about how we do that. So in essence, we aim to create a unified learning analytics infrastructure for teaching and learning both on and off campus. This year we've also worked hard at UT Austin to establish a new governance structure for what we've come to call technology enhanced education. We work closely with our faculty council, with other key stakeholders, and I'll talk in a minute about why I think this is going to be important. We've also reached out to other institutions. We've established a network of Texas colleges and universities, about a dozen Texas colleges, community colleges and universities, multiple system offices, and also a network of public flagship universities that includes about 20 of the leading American public research universities and then partner organizations. So just for a moment, I'd like to talk about these cross-institutional partnerships and illustrate with one of our initiatives that's come out of our Texas consortium. So one of the key themes that we emphasize at Texas is the idea of the greater higher education ecosystem. That includes high schools, community colleges, broad access universities, as well as research universities. And as I mentioned, we're already a large campus with more than 52,000 residential students. So we aim to serve more students through 3 different strategies. We are working a lot on our throughput, our own accelerating time to degree, our own graduation rates, but also expanding access through new delivery models, through online courses and new limited residency programs, and these strategic partnerships with other institutions, including high schools and community colleges. So to illustrate these last two strategies, we're leading the development of a suite of lower division courses through an initiative called On-Ramps, with these courses being specifically designed to be deployed in multiple educational contexts, including high schools or community colleges. So this year we'll have about 2,500 students in 4 courses across the state of Texas. There's 2 key differences I'd like to mention between these courses and what we do, say, with our edX MOOCs. First, these courses are all designed for blended delivery, so in a couple of weeks we'll have teachers come to our campus at UT Austin. They'll be trained on content, they'll be trained on progressive pedagogies that are integrated with these courses, and also into the technologies. And second, the technologies that we use are the same, essentially the same technologies we use on campus. I don't know if we still have our Instructure here back there. We use the Canvas LMS. And we've been excited about working with Instructure and with Canvas because we leverage the authoring tools. And so the idea is that we want to build facilitated networks around these courses that then we can, so we can adapt the materials to different contexts so teachers and students can iterate on them. So instead of using the learning analytics to predict students' learning states against a fixed set of content, our idea is to develop these facilitated networks so that like our faculty might think that we've got the greatest presentation of a key concept, but maybe one of Georgia's undergraduates at UT Arlington or even some high school students might have a better way of presenting materials. So initiatives like these that we've been working on in the last few years at Austin are tremendously exciting. They also are happening in an enormously complex policy context, national, state, system, and institutional policy context. In each of these contexts, the color, the shape, they facilitate, and sometimes they impede the things that we're trying to do on campus and that we're doing in partnership with other campuses. So I want to highlight just a few of these. So for example, in the United States now, we've seen across the political spectrum broad calls for higher education reform, for increased productivity, especially been focused on costs and on the debt burden on students. So at least in higher education, we haven't seen, we've seen the public have a lot of optimism about online learning, less concern about data mining and privacy. We've seen some of that come up on the K-12 side. But this may just be because of the big data and analytics have a lot of appeal for generations that are used to having recommendations automated about what to buy and who to friend and those kinds of things. But I'd like to raise a flag about it because I think that at the same time that we have all this optimism and enthusiasm about online learning, there's a drumbeat of news stories about data breaches, about financial data. There's also this trend on the right and on the left towards focus on individual liberty in our politics. And I think it wouldn't take much, actually, for us to end up with much more restrictive policies about individual data. So I loved Tiffany's point earlier about respecting and engaging our students in this work. And of course, we have initiatives where we're working on doing this. And I think we all need to be much more careful about this, especially over the next couple of years, because our students are going to have a powerful vote in how we're able to leverage the power of the learning analytics, which is going to be reflected in their choices about which institutions to join, which courses to take, and also which of their own data they're willing to expose. Personally, I think I agree with Tiffany. I think we need to work much harder to engage our students in this work with us. I also want to flag that at every level, our policy frameworks and our discussions about finance, about accountability, degree pathways, tend to assume traditional modes of delivery. So the kinds of modes of delivery that I was talking about before, the cross-institutional partnerships, this is not how the system was engineered, right? And they didn't anticipate building this kind of system that we're working on at UT Austin. Some of your other institutions are working on as well. and also just speaking for myself, not on behalf of my institution, I'd suggest that our administrators, our faculty, and even some of our critics also ought to be paying much closer attention to the changing patterns of student consumption and the choices that the students are making. So we're seeing many more students take courses from multiple institutions, transferring courses into the institution, be simultaneously enrolled with multiple institutions, and the combination of state and institutional policies, for example, that encourage students to take college courses like ours while they're enrolled in high school, it introduces a lot of complexities because with limited access to the kind of data about the experiences that the students have had. So we have these romantic ideas about how we were going to leverage learning analytics and redesign the first year experience, and then it turns out the students actually don't take those courses with us. So to wrap up, I know I'm out of time. Let me just flag a couple of the policy and strategy challenges I think lie ahead for learning analytics. First, so Christy, you mentioned that while it's expensive to build these learning analytics infrastructures and the kinds of courses that we're talking about, perhaps there's an analogy with healthcare, and this has come up before about, well, if we can invest in primary care, then perhaps we don't need expensive specialists on the back end and not as many emergency room visits, that sort of thing. So in our context, I have some concerns with this idea, actually, because surely it's the case that if we could flag and address students' learning needs earlier, we can improve student success, and there's some good results and discussions that we've heard about this already. It won't necessarily save us money, however, and it might actually increase the budget pressures on our departments and on our institutions. So, for example, at UT Austin, as we work on improving our throughput, improving our time to degree, that puts pressure on the upper division. So there may be savings, there may be some additional revenue from the kinds of things we're doing, but this won't necessarily accrue to the units that are incurring higher costs. And so there's this, so in general, in higher education, the costs of failure have been pushed back on students. And I think so it's an open question about whether students are going to be also willing to pay for the increased cost of success. So in some ways, this is a good problem to have. But on the other hand, we have this question about who pays that looms large. I think it's an open question about how all this work is going to continue to develop in institutions that are committed to a tradition of faculty autonomy about how they teach their courses and the content that they present. So if we succeed in extending our platforms as we've discussed, how is this data going to be presented? How is it going to be used by administrators? How is it going to be used effectively by faculty? And are institutions for the long term going to be willing to make these kinds of major investments in their teaching learning infrastructure? So there's one other issue I just want to flag as I'm sitting down. As long as I'm talking about data access, I also want to flag there's multiple and competing interpretations about FERPA that governs the rights to access parents and students' data. This needs to be smoothed out across the states. This is something that we're working on. But it also raises the issue about, as we're successful with this sort of work, how much of this data is going to be discoverable? How much of this data will be subject to open records requests that we see in Texas? How much of this data is going to be open through Freedom of Information Act? So already our faculty are very nervous about having your course instructor data available on the web. Well, how are they going to feel about much more detailed data about about teaching performance, about student performance being widely available? So anyway, I want to say again, thank you very much for including me in the conversation. I'm encouraged. I'm excited about the discussions of the past few days. Thanks very much to George and the organizers. And I look forward to the Q&A.
There's so much in there that was really interesting, and I love that ending point on the freedom of information requests that come in for this data, and that's something that I haven't heard a lot of us talking about at LAC, and it really does. It really is an interesting question, I think, for us to consider. All right, so I'm Chris Brooks from the University of Michigan.
Things that work.
Things that don't. Yeah. All right, how are we doing? All right. I'm Chris Brooks from the University of Michigan. I don't need internet, so hopefully this just works. Yeah.
You don't touch the wrong button.
Thanks. I'm going to talk about a couple of things I've seen. Before at the University of Michigan, I was in Canada at the University of Saskatchewan, and I've seen a couple of things that I think work and a couple of things that don't, specifically when it comes to building institutional capacity and a program of learning analytics at your institution. So this is not specific about research, and it's more about that programmatic view. So there's a couple of different stakeholders involved in the process, and they all come with their own baggage, and it's important to be able to recognize that baggage early and get around it so that you can move forward with building such a system. So central IT is often a driver of learning analytics, and maybe if I could just see a raise of hands, how many people are involved with their central IT group, or their central IT group does their teaching and learning? Okay, so a few. So the challenge here is to keep, I think, a broad perspective of what learning is, and there's often a propensity to jump into products and to buy products quickly and to do product evaluations and large consultative product evaluations, but without setting clear goals for an institutional learning analytics program first. And so then there often tends to be a mismatch between the products, and then you're trying to say, well, now that we've set these goals, after we bought the product, how can we use those products to meet those goals? And so I see a lot of discussion about this, and I'm not actually sure that vendors are as helpful as they could be here that they're pushing products for specific goals and not maybe trying to listen and understand the goals from the institution and really try and force the institution to reflect and set those goals. There's also a potential arrogance with technical skills. And so what I've seen in some IT departments is people saying, oh no, it can't do that, or we're the only ones who can do that. But there's often technical skills distributed across the campus, in research groups, in centers for teaching and learning. And so there's some potential challenges there. Another body that's often involved in the learning analytics discussion in an institution is the Centers for Teaching and Learning, or Teaching Success, and so forth. Maybe if I could just see a raise of hands of who's kind of involved with it. There's a lot of people not involved in these first two groups, so that'll be interesting. So the challenge here is to keep in mind institutional strategy and strategic enrollment, and keep an open mind to data-driven discovery of learning versus theory-driven. And I see this as a very tense discussion often that, okay, these are just new tools, but we're still, we want active learning. That's the theory that we're going to apply to all of our classes. But there is some really interesting things that come out of learning analytics telling us about how these theories match what our students are actually doing. And we need to keep, I think, open minds to that data-driven process of learning analytics. And then there's, I think, here as well, a potential arrogance with respect to what real learning is. And often that, we're the only experts in learning, and these other groups maybe don't know. So then the last group, which I imagine will have a lot of hands. Can I see how many people are part of researchers in learning analytics? Okay. So I think researchers are a key component, actually, of an institutional learning analytics program and strategy, and are often mixed. Sometimes the researchers are trying to drive the discussion. Sometimes the researchers get fed up with all the red tape and baloney and just go off and do their own thing. But I see that the strongest programs that exist are the ones that are doing innovative scholarly work at the same time as doing applying that work for impact in the institution. And so I really think it's a discussion that involves these three groups. So recognizing the partnership that these academics bring is important, but also academics realizing that everybody else is generally on a cost recovery basis of some sort, and so that it's expensive to engage is important. The focus of these groups tends to be on publication and not on solid software that can be deployed across the whole institution, or solid programming that fits a different level of student across the institution, and tends to be on experimenting as opposed to deploying. So that's a potential tension that seems to exist. And one barrier that this group, I've seen in several cases now, faces is showing that graduate students actually have something to provide of value at the same time that that value is rigorous enough that it can actually be deployed and impact the whole campus. And that's a negotiation, and the researchers in the room know that really depends on the grad student. So finding ways not to oversell grad students who shouldn't be oversold and to rally behind grad students who should is a potential tension there. Now, this is not advancing slides. All right, so who really should be responsible for learning analytics at the institution? Which one of these groups should drive? And I think my suggestion is it's the provost. And so these groups, it's good to build capacity and interest amongst these groups, but the provost has to be the one to say, yes, we need an institutional learning analytics program. And at the institutions I've seen this be successful, it is coming from the provost's office. Now that doesn't have to mean that the provost is the one who came up with the idea. These groups can certainly grassroots bring that idea, form that idea, and scaffold it with the provost, but the provost in the end has to be the one that says this is important for our institution. And then they have to drop a couple of $1 million on the table to help make it actually happen. So I think there's a coordination role certainly from the provost. There's a scope and a commitment that the provost has to be able to set. One of the problems with learning analytics and places I've seen it die is when we just have these conversations about all the things we could do, whether it's retention, whether it's improving grades, whether it's getting specific groups of students targeted, etc. All of a sudden there's so many items on the table that we can't focus on a few, and then it's to fund. The very first duty I think that we all have, though, when involved in this kind of endeavor, is to come up with a data governance and privacy policy. And George Siemens mentioned this earlier on. This is kind of the dropping of the pants effect, right? You just say, well, what about student privacy? And then everybody's like, okay, let's go for lunch. We're done. And I think that's a huge challenge. And where I've seen these programs succeed is where this was addressed as the very first part of the challenge. Perhaps even before learning analytics is mentioned, and there's a strong data governance policy and a strong privacy policy that have come out. And leverage your peer institutions for this. There are now several institutions that have great examples of these data governance and privacy policies. There's more all the time. Get in contact with peer institutions, find one that's appropriate for you, and leverage it as much as you can. So here's a couple of things that you might want to do once you get that provost support. Build and deploy innovative tools. So here's a tool at the University of Michigan called Student Explorer. It's a dashboard essentially for tutors and helpers of students so that they can see some background of the students and contextualize what those students are doing. We're tying some predictive modeling into it. It's great, and it's the kind of thing that you can do when you have the provost saying, IT, teaching and learning, and researchers, please all work together and come up with kind of innovative ideas. Another one that I'll talk just briefly about here is our Student Learning Analytics at Michigan program, SLAM. Rachel, if you could just raise your hand here. Rachel is our coordinator for this program. We actually have a task force that manages this program. Many wonderful things have come from it. We had a fellows program, so these were small grants for faculty and students or staff members to work together to do innovative things with learning analytics. small collaborative projects, built capacity on institutional data, was wonderful. And I think this is really a gateway to bringing in, or can be a gateway, it's not the only gateway, to bringing in that Learning Analytics Master's program at institutions. And so this is a great thing to look at. There's also a wonderful speaker series focused on both local and international experts. If you Google SLAM, and maybe SLAM Michigan, you'll find the archives of the videos of those speaker series. They're just excellent. And an important result of this is that for me, it's moved the conversation between them, but beyond the pants dropping. And so we have, for instance, a draft policy on expediting data sharing within Michigan for educational research, which data stewards at the institution are looking to sign into. And so essentially this will mean if you're doing educational research, all of a sudden you just get access to all the wonderful data in the warehouse. We're also moving towards open educational data sets for our MOOC data, where the idea is that we'll freely share this. And this helps address a number of the FERPA and the open access issues because we address them once and then kind of move forward. So the pants are back on and everybody at the table, and we're having really great conversations because I think the Provost is helping to drive this through our digital education and innovation group. And so with that, I'll call on Doug to come and fix the computer and do his.
He's been tweeting.
I love how computer scientists can program a hand to slap students when they're not paying attention, but you can't work PowerPoint. That's great, isn't it? George Seniors has promised another pants-dropping effect if anyone's staying around later this afternoon. If you're not out the door by a particular time through the building, pants do come down. That's just a quick one.
Sometimes I wonder whether you're kidding or not. I wish I was, though. Okay. I can't see whether that's working. It's working here, so I can read my slides. And you can read my slides too. We're all on the same page and working together, and that's wonderful. Excellent. Okay. I'm Doug Clow, as Shane was saying. I'm from the Open University. I'm going to give a few bits and pieces of reflection about strategy and policy and a bit of advice, because I'm standing up here so I can tell you what you ought to do, but don't do just what we do. I'm giving you the stuff that worked well for us. And my main message, I think, is that you should have a strategy and policy about learning analytics. If you think you don't, then you probably do have a strategy and policy for learning analytics. It's just kind of a sucky strategy. So I think having an explicit, clear one is much better than thinking you don't have one. So a little bit of background about the Open University. We're the largest university in the UK, depending how you measure us. We have about 200,000 students, about 7,000 tutors, about 1,000 academic faculty. And we teach by supported open learning, so we're not a campus institution. Our students are spread around all over the UK, mostly online, increasingly online, so we're getting more and more data from those people. So we've got something like 600 courses that's going down, about 1 million assignments filled in every year, and something like the last figure on the bottom of there, about 3 million Moodle transactions a day. That's actually a figure from 2011, that's almost certainly higher now. We are the second largest Moodle installation in the world. The idea is we're really big with this huge gorilla, but actually we care about each individual student. So that's what I'm trying to get across here is we're about. But the other thing this gives us, we do have a lot of data, and because we're large, it's worth us spending the extra effort in designing systems that can support students and defraying that cost across a lot of students. So some of the things that work for us economically might not work for everyone else. A central message of, I think, learning analytics for senior managers, they love this stuff. It's like, we're an internet-y bunch, so I've got a cat picture. We've got a, yeah. Dashboards and metrics, that's kind of the world that senior managers live in or like to live in. And so if we can give them dashboards and metrics, that's great. It's an easy sell, which is a great thing. That's really good because you can get senior level attention and focus and buy into this stuff. It's also bad because the sort of focus that they'll bring to that is not necessarily the focus on teaching and learning that we really care about. So my other message is get involved in these conversations because they'll be developing dashboards and metrics and this sort of stuff without you if you're not in there getting the teaching and learning, the quality of the learning experience reflected in the stuff that they're looking at on their dashboards, because if it's not on their dashboards, it kind of doesn't exist. At the Open University, we've been very lucky. We've got senior managers who do understand this and are talking to people. This is our Pro Vice Chancellor for Learning and Teaching, Belinda Tynan, and has been working on this with Simon Buckingham-Shum, who many of you will know well. But the level of buy-in at senior level was so great that they made to analytics was that they made a really shiny video, which I won't show you now, but if you want to see it later, I can show you. It's a shiny sort of, this is our vision for once ago. It's a very good vision, and it's actually a lot of it's reflected in some of the solar reports. Just to give you a little flavour of where we're moving on to now, we've done a lot of base work. We've got a big project now that's kicking off at the moment, that's got lots and lots of strands, trying to improve our capability to do things. Fundamentally, we're looking at an intervention and evaluation framework. So looking at when we're trying to do things to improve retention, get our students progressed and completed and successful, not just when we're trying to do something to improve that, making an intervention, not just looking at the effect that it has on retention right down the line, but when you're doing an intervention, you're probably thinking that there's some immediate effect that you ought to see about that. So say you think, we've got a problem with this assignment, so we want to change that in order to improve retention. We're also then looking at what effect is that having on the assignment that you thought it should have an effect on as a proxy measure to see a quicker measure of success for that intervention, rather than waiting all the way down the line until we find out about the retention data. And also the retention is affected by loads and loads of factors, whereas what's affecting this thing that you're intervening on is much more immediate and might be just affected by what you're talking about. We're trying to gear up what we can do about data visualization, and this is when Chris was talking about being careful about your product evaluations and thinking you're just buying something and get it. That rang a lot of bells for me, because we're in the middle of the procurement process here, and it's very apparent when we're doing this work that actually the particular product we choose to enable us to make data visualizations really doesn't matter. Almost all of them will do most of what we want. The real difference will be what visualizations we make, whether those actually make a difference to our students. And so it's focusing too much on the technology can get you lost. It needs to be a system that across the institution that will help you do better things. Another thing I'm particularly proud of is that the ethics framework was on the critical path for this whole project, that a whole load of stuff couldn't be done until we'd sorted out our ethics framework and what we needed to do there, because as many people have been saying, there's a lot of potential to do bad things here, and that's the last thing we want to do, so we've been working on that. We've been doing predictive modelling. I won't talk at length about all of this stuff. There's a whole load of things going on. The final strand here is, of course, dear to my heart, is getting stuff, not necessarily big data, much more smaller stuff, feeding back to students, which is an easy sell at this conference. This is just a way I have of thinking about the scale and impact of an intervention some analytics can have. The idea here is an individual learner, they're bigger, they can do, their bar is taller, they can respond much quicker than the policymakers down at the side. They're much slower, but they can have an impact across a whole sector. But as well as that aspect, it's 3D. The learner's much closer to the actual learning. So if you've got a system that's detected actually this student's struggling, the learner not only can act more quickly on that, they can decide right now to study instead of going to the bar, but also they understand their learning, they understand their problems much better than anyone else. And so getting these sorts of metrics, rather than the stuff that the managers and policymakers like, the dashboardy stuff tends to be that way, focusing it down on the learning and teaching, I think really makes a difference. And that's a thing that a lot of analytics work can get pulled away if the senior managers get carried away with just the senior management sort of view. We also have a team of people called data wranglers, whom I'm one, which is my favourite job title ever. The idea here is to have human sense makers, people who go and work with the data, try and understand it, and mediate that to faculty who are actually in a position to do something about it, and to very quickly give you an idea of the idealised way that this should work. You start off, I have a load of users, mostly faculty, but all sorts of other people supporting teaching and learning, including learners themselves. and some of them are making some use of some of the data that we've got, but it's not very systematic, there's not a lot of it. We bring in the data wrangler, they look across all of the data and feed that through to all of the stakeholders who might need to see it and interrogate that. And this is a two-way process very much. It's not just going from the data and giving that to the users, it's also using the users, making sense of it, what makes a difference, what is giving you insight that you can do something about, and feeding that back to the systems and processes and people who generate and collect that data to improve that and to focus on what we're doing. And once you've done that and you're engaging the users in this data, you can start to build a network so that those users can get directly at the data that answers questions that they need answered that make a difference to teaching and learning. So that gives you a much richer, much more complex and much more capability of acting as a learning analytics system. So I'll finish up here that it's only through a detailed nitty-gritty process of engagement and dialogue between data analysts, people who can do this sort of stuff, and the stakeholders, the people who actually understand the teaching and learning context and the data itself, the sort of three-way conversation. It's only through that conversation that you can really get insight and organisational change developed. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Doug, and thank you very much to all the panel members. We'll open up now for some discussion and a bit of questions there, how you'd like to direct them. So, some interesting processes going from government all the way down to institutional and researcher level around the impact of policy or how we can actually grow analytics and how policy can help inform that process. Have any questions from the Lassie locals as well, if you're out there? Do I have to pull Charles up here with his cranky voice? Future questions.
Just told you all everything, isn't it?
So, I actually have one coming in from Uruguay, from Nigel. From Uruguay, another Lassie local there. I'd like to ask about, yesterday George made Al made a comment about the skills of an individual learning analytics person. We spoke about Python and R being essential skills there. George then put a post out on our Google group, and there was lots of comments about it. No, they need to have more education practice, and there's sort of this to and fro. I'd like us to actually stop thinking about the skills of the individual and the skills of the team. So I've read, without exaggeration, 4 million learning analytics papers that all tell me that learning analytics is an interdisciplinary field, but then we always focus back on the individual. So what is the composition that makes up the team? And I'll go to Harrison here, because you spoke about the brokers basically as are interpreted in the faculty. How do these brokers play a role in developing those team-based skills that will actually do the interpretation of policy all the way down to data and back up again?
Right. So this is an issue that we're working through right now. I mean, so one of the advantages and disadvantages of trying to pull together an interdisciplinary team is that different faculty see different shapes in the data and they bring different techniques in the data, right? So we have folks from computer science and psychology and economics and our School of Information that are going to approach the same data sets very differently. We're at a phase right now where we're thinking more about, okay, so how do we set up the context where we can have these conversations, where we can work through it, where we can identify, well, what are some of the key skills? Like we need people to be able to source all this institutional data. So, you know, I love the data wrangler assignment, you know, that's exactly the kind of positions that we're short on, right? But you know, I think for us, what's been a promising strategy is then to drive resources to these faculty who are leading individual projects, and then try to set up a context where they can be in dialogue with others.
It's a related question. How did the upper administration get to know what's in their own institution? How do you go about finding out and mining the resources within your own institution? I mean the people resources. My experience is that the researchers are the last ones in, and they're kind of going, why didn't you ask me? I've been doing this stuff for years. So just experiences. I mean, how do you go about using your own resources within your own schools?
So I'll just mention something briefly with respect to that, but at Michigan it was actually very much a grassroots academic interest that drove that, and so there were a few strong academics from different disciplines, physics, the iSchool, education, that got together and each had individual research projects that they saw some significant overlap. And so then they went forth to the provost and kind of did that push to the provost to garner resources there, bringing in then the various different service units on campus. So I think that researcher-led teams definitely can work.
Hi, Stephen Hochleib, University of Toronto. So more a comment, or just keep thinking about this, because I really like that LAC actually a presentation from OU about the data wranglers and how you had this infrastructure where you could have someone do an analysis, you had other people peer reviewing it, you had templates and workflows and stuff. So, and it was also funny coming back to my own institution and thinking I've been involved with learning analytics because of the MOOC projects, which are always criticized for being, oh, they're not research-based and whatever. And then you go back to your university and you think, are we actually doing any learning analytics on all the regular courses? Because that seems to be really interesting. And what I found at my institution is that there seems to be an incredible amount of effort, totally distributed. Every faculty has people doing this. Every, professors have graduate students crunching their surveys. There's a lack of, there's levels, right? There's like 1,000 people programming Python that never meet each other and never do meetups, never share code, never kind of show each other cool hacks. There's tons of people doing statistics and learning analytics and also don't have that community. And then there's the disconnect between the researchers who are doing kind of primary exploratory research and get a one-time extraction of data, run it through all kinds of processes and write a paper, and then taking that and saying, hey, let's actually now set this up as a dashboard, let's implement this, And I wonder, and there's a disconnect between the School of Education and the Center for Teaching and Learning, which aren't talking to each other at all, right? So, I know this isn't, but how can we kind of, and I hope that there are institutions out there that are maybe more integrated and forward-thinking, and I'm hoping this is going to change, but how do you get these kind of different people and roles to talk to each other? Where do you find the funding to take some really great research product and make that available to people? Thoughts about that?
I would agree, and I would agree that that was one of the key focus that we took in the solar discussion paper for the federal government, that we do know it is about key leadership. It is about having, and the same thing that Chris and Harrison had said, and Doug as well, it's actually having ownership at the central level who is responsible for putting all of those fingers into everything and bringing everybody together. And I strongly agree with Shane's statement is that if this is a team approach, we have a number of institutions at the moment looking to hire learning analytics specialists. Look at the ads, look at what's going out there, and yet that's not what they need. They need people to talk to each other. They need people to integrate the data. You do need people who do have an educational background, who understand the teaching of doing. You need the people who have the statistical modeling. So we do have some instances where it has been done well. And it has been done well because it is from that central leadership, and it's pulling everybody together. It's pulling people together to meet, to talk, to do what it is that needs to be done. So, and as I had mentioned, we do work in a siloed industry, and unfortunately it's breaking down those silos, which we have been talking about for a while. And there are successful cases that can do it and have done it. And it's actually talking to those peers and doing it as well. And that's one of the ways where we can see a group such as this. We're talking to people to say, yes, it can be done, it can be successful, and just stop taking your trucks and not playing with others out of the sandbox. Stay in the sandbox.
Can I just add on that? I think the senior buy-in is really important for getting a systemic change across an institution, but it's necessary for that level, but it's not sufficient. You do need, just like Grace was saying, the engagement of all the stakeholders who are there. It's not just, and I really like this, the idea that we're developing in this panel about not for, as Shane was saying, not just trying to get a single individual who can do absolutely everything, because you might be able to find 1 or 2 people like that in the world, but most people.
Thank you, Doug.
Yeah, ourselves. Oh, and happy birthday, by the way. Okay. Just give you a bit of extra attention there. But I think this working in teams and pulling all of the stakeholders together is really important. How do you get that senior level buy-in? I think Solar's got a nice set of resources to help engage senior management with, trying to get that conversation going. But before you get there, it's worth plugging away at it, trying to see building up the individual relationships with the senior managers in your institution, but also working away, building the connections yourself, finding the people. These people exist at your institution. You don't need permission from senior management to go talk to people who can help you out with this stuff. Build your own network. Start if you haven't got the level of resource, it'll have to be stuff that people can do in the margins of their time. But you can get working that way. You can build networks, build capacity, so that when finally you do get the senior level buy-in, you're in a position to move quickly and to do something that makes a lot of sense, that's informed by what's actually going on the ground.
At Texas, there's 2 things that have been really helpful for us. One is that we essentially took 3 different portfolios of work and combined them so that we had enough resources that, driven through the provost's office, where we could create these win-wins and RAs. And so you have, and everybody's interested in talking to you when you've got resources that you can drive to their units, right? But the other thing has been around having a formal governance structure in a way that the different stakeholders actually feel like that they get a say that's going to matter, where recommendations will go to the provost and to the key deans, and they get to weigh in on these institutional policy deliberations.
And just to step back from that, if you feel that you're not connected to the people that you need to kind of bring together to move it forward to the provost, then just start acting like you own it and start asking for data and be outlandish in your requests and just send it to the IT tech support. And they'll find you very quickly. They'll say no, and you'll say, well, why not? All these other institutions get to do that. And they'll say, why don't we have a meeting? And then you start to build that capacity and that discussion. So if it's connectivity, I really see a lot of institutions having star researchers who just start doing, and that drives the discussion. And then the next barrier to success at the institution is getting these stakeholders on board to stop doing it by yourself and to drive it as a team under the provost's banner.
All right, just the comments here are very academic-centric. I would like to ask what, at the University of Michigan, one extra thing we've done is to open up the entrepreneurial spirit. We have an incubator there for educational startups, and I think there's value in that as well to attract the students or the faculty who have the good ideas. It shouldn't necessarily all happen in the institution. Let the students and faculty build themselves and grow through that mechanism as well.
Cool. Agree.
Thanks so much, Beck. I think just as a last comment to close up, Chris and Harrison both mentioned Chris said fund it if you want it to get up and running, and Harrison then sort of raised the conflict between the operational side and having enough dollars to support initiatives like this. I think there's other ways we can look at the system and the inefficiencies associated with the system, because lots of time you do get funding. There's a lot of money out there that's associated with learning analytics, but then you don't actually look at the implementation of that and how it will actually impact the everyday practitioner. So what are the performance indicators that a practitioner has to come up to and report to their head of school and say, this is the research I did this year, this is the teaching performance that I had this year. What data do they need in their hands and how do they conflict? So there's efficiencies there and ways in which we can actually get practitioners to adopt these things that you mentioned. It doesn't have to be privacy issues associated with it. It can be a way in which I can demonstrate. Give me something I can demonstrate on a good teacher beyond a student evaluation or ratemyprofessor.com. There must be something else out there. I'd like to give a big hand of applause for our 4 esteemed